Okay, great. Hello, everybody. We should be recording now. Our webinar today is going to last about 1 hour, which is including some time for some questions. We're very excited to have Sarah Jane Harknett from the Cambridge University Museums talking to us about visitor tracking, giving us some ideas. My name is Jennifer. I am from Cape Measures Consulting. I am going to be facilitating the webinar today. So basically what I'm going to do is just keep an eye on the chat room. So if you've got any questions, please post them, any comments, examples, anything you want to add. Sarah Jane's going to take a little break about halfway through, so I'm sure she can gather her thoughts, but more importantly, so we can have a look at the questions and answer some of those. And then, of course, there'll be some time at the end to ask some more questions. So, it doesn't seem to have anyone else logging on, so we'll get going. Firstly, Ian, before we introduce Sarah Jane, just to have a little reminder, so the ReFresh project, it's 12 museums across 3 counties across South East England. The main aim of the project is about refreshing displays and improving the visitor experience. So here at Cape Measures Consulting, we've been involved in coordinating and helping out with the museums involved in those, in phase 1 and phase 2 of that. The project will be continuing on, and of course some of you have been involved in this, so you'll know a lot about it. Okay, so smashing. So I will now hand you over to Sarah Jane, who is going to talk to us about visitor tracking and offer us an introduction and a guide on how and why to do it. So over to you. Thanks, Sarah Jane.
Thank you very much indeed. So yes, we're looking at a practical introduction to visitor tracking, and I hope that we're going to be able to look at how visitors use gallery spaces, drawing on some examples of work that I've been doing across all the University of Cambridge museums, looking at some practicalities, how the data can be used, some of the things that we've learned as well. So I'm Sarah Jane. I'm the Education Officer at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, but I also work on this project across lots of the university museums. Here in this picture is the Museum of Zoology. And I'm not putting myself out there as a particular expert in tracking. My experience has been built up over the last few years, tracking in a wide variety of collections that we've got here in Cambridge, from the Zoology Museum, like you can see here, fine art collections, contemporary art displays, archaeology, geology, lots of different places that we've been tracking in, lots of different sizes. I'm not putting myself out there as an expert at statistics or at design or at spreadsheets, but I just wanted to share with you how we've done it and things that we've learnt. But if you've got tips or thoughts or suggestions or practical examples that you know of, then use that chat facility, let us know, and I would really benefit from that as well. So visitor tracking, really I thought we should probably start with what is the point of doing it. This is the museum that I work for. In fact, it's our old archaeology displays. We had a big redevelopment we reopened in May 2012, and our old galleries looked like this. There's lots of objects, which I really like. You can maybe see there's some text panels, long text panels, and the objects were displayed on Hessian and felt. They were displayed in the mid-1980s. And we in museums spend a lot of our time working on our displays, creating, refreshing. It's a big proportion of our time. And we hope that visitors come in to see those displays, or to use the loo, or visit the shop, or use as a tourist information site, whatever those things. But we really want people to engage with those displays. And we want to know what they're doing. I find it fascinating. I was really interested to know, how do they visit? Where do they go? And why are they going there? So a few years ago, we had some funding from the Designation Challenge Fund to do some evaluation in our galleries. So they were looking a bit tired, they were looking a bit dated, and we were able to use a variety of evaluation methods, focus groups, questionnaires, guided interviews, and we used quite a lot of tracking. And tracking was the thing that I found was the most persuasive, particularly when I was trying to feed back to some of our curatorial staff. So when I'd done the tracking in the ground floor, I came up with a thermal plan like this. And here you can see the 2 most popular elements of our ground floor displays. Now, bear in mind that we have an amazing collection that covers, 1,000-year-old Peruvian featherwork and gold torques from East Anglia, magnificent Anglo-Saxon jewellery, and yet the two most popular cases. On the right, you can see that orange band on the thermal map. That's that picture that you see on the right there. It was a display of 19th century flint knapping called bubba hatching on the Sosh. I don't know either. And then the second most popular display in the whole museum was this one that you can see the photograph on the left, titled Megaliths in Europe. There's a picture, a very old faded picture of Stonehenge, some photographs of other megalithic sites, a map and some text. And I have to say, my colleague and I, when we discovered that these were the bits where most people were stopping, we pretty much just wept, really, because here we have this amazing collection, and yet where people were going with these two parts, and that was really disheartening for us, and we knew that we had to do something about it. And this evidence that we built up through tracking and other evaluation methods, we used it to provide evidence to our funders, and we used it to help plan our redisplay, looking at areas that were perhaps underused, thinking about the traffic, the flow, thinking about sight lines, thinking about labelling. We used our tracking evidence in all of those different ways. And as I said, it's not necessarily that we've got everything right. So now I'm working across all the University of Cambridge museums, tracking in lots of different museums, in spaces from small temporary displays through to whole galleries, even occasionally a whole museum. And this tracking work that we do is carried out by a team of volunteers that I train up. And then they're complemented with a set of exit interviews that we do. And we're really doing it to help improve the experience for our visitors. I think that's kind of key to what we're doing, is that it is visitor-led. What we're doing is trying to make it a better experience. Some people have used the evidence to go back to funders. People have used what we've done in lots of different ways. They've tweaked their standard temporary exhibition set, lots of different ways. So how do we actually do it? And my presentation was looking a bit dry, so I put in quite a lot of photographs from the museum's historic photograph collections. And I love this picture. It was taken in 1934 in Ghana. But I would say, before you start, actually don't start yet. Don't start with tracking until you know it's the right way to evaluate the space where you are. And I know that kind of sounds counterintuitive in a session where I've promised you a practical introduction. But the first thing to do is to work out, is tracking the right method for you? And there's been quite a lot of criticism of tracking studies in the past. I was at a presentation the other week where someone said, well, tracking studies, it just doesn't tell you very much. And I would dispute that, of course, but I think you need to choose the right evaluation for the questions that you are asking in your institution. Tracking can help you to find out where people are going. It might help you to look at some of the behaviours that people are doing. It might tell you which areas are being ignored, but it's not going to tell you what someone thinks about the text. If you're timing someone in front of a case and they're reading intently, or in front of a text panel, you don't know whether they're spending a long time there because that text is so gripping, or whether they've read the first sentence 7 times and actually are still trying to work out what it actually means. Tracking just that time isn't going to tell you that your text is accessible, but I think tracking can help you build up a picture of how your gallery and your space is being used. So before you start, just don't start quite yet. Don't start until you know that it's right. And I'd encourage you to look at some, if you haven't already. You might be over familiar with these things, but check out the Visitor Studies Group website. Check out this evaluation toolkit, which you can download from the website. It gives you lots of ideas of different evaluation methods and their advantages and disadvantages. But really make sure that tracking is going to be the right thing for your space. There might be a more appropriate method, so just make sure that it's right. Don't start tracking if you don't have enough time. It is a time-consuming process. Actually collecting the data in the first place is very time-consuming. If you're going for a certain number of trackings, If you're inputting the data, that in itself is days worth of work. Sitting down and having enough time to analyse the data, again, quite a lot of work there too. So make sure that you've fully counted the cost before you start. And I would say, don't start unless you're ready to let it change the way that you visit a museum, and for that matter, John Lewis or Tesco's or anywhere else where you might end up shopping. It'll probably change the way that you become a museum visitor. And I know that I've had volunteers who've been really cross with me because they said, oh, I've been waiting for this exhibition for ages. And said, I went in and I just thought, why have they put that there? And I've had people who've said that they've ended up not looking at an exhibition, but ended up just watching the visitors, seeing how the visitors are using the space, because she'd spent a lot of time tracking in various museum spaces. You might find yourself thinking, oh, I wonder how many people actually look at that case, or they did a really good thing putting that object there. Or if you're going around the department store, then you've got that, why did they put those t-shirts there? Lots of the background to tracking visitors actually comes from shopping theory. And if you want a fascinating, readable introduction, there's a book by a guy called Paco Underhill called Why We Buy, The Science of Shopping. Paco Underhill, Why We Buy. You can pick it up secondhand quite cheaply. It was published in 1999. It's a really interesting introduction to this whole kind of concept. Shops have a lot more money than museums. They do it on a massive scale. So if once you've worked out that it is the right thing for your space, then we need to work out how to do it. So first of all, I think that it's really important that we start with a kind of ethical underpinning to what we do. We're interested in how visitors naturally use the observation space. So I don't ask permission before the tracking starts. But it's not ethical to not allow people to know what's happening and to give the option to withdraw if they want to. So I always put up signage. My volunteers usually wear badges to say who they are. And we usually have a sign that just says something very simple, like, we're currently evaluating the displays in this gallery. This information will be used to improve future exhibitions. And we do always allow the option to withdraw, just like this Faience Egyptian hedgehog. I always tell my trackers to go and speak to gallery attendants, not only because they need to know what's going on for security reasons, but also because gallery attendants give you the best insights into how your gallery is being used. We were tracking in a gallery space, and one of my trackers was there, and she'd been there for I don't know, an hour, I think. And it had been, the gallery was sort of buzzing, but she was watching at the entrance, and people weren't really coming in, and she'd done a few, and one of the gallery attendants came over to her and said, do you know that lots of people use this gallery backwards? So if you go and stand by the exit, I think you'll get quite a few more people. So this volunteer then went and tracked from the exit going the other way. What we discovered was that 24% of visitors used that gallery completely backwards. The curators had one definite linear view in mind. The story started obviously at the beginning and it went through a progression to the end, but nearly a quarter of people were doing it the opposite way round to how the curator's vision was working. And those kind of things we can go back, and that's where your gallery attendants, staff that are on the ground actually watching people. So we do talk to them for security reasons, but also they can be your fantastic eyes and ears on the ground that can help you with what you're doing. I always get trackers always ready to explain what they're doing if the person or any other visitor approaches them. And they are always offered the option to be withdrawn from the study. Then that tracking sheet is completely removed. And I just asked them to make a note that they've had a refusal. And I think we've done several hundred trackings now. And I think we've only had 4 people that have ever approached the person doing the tracking to say, are you watching me or are you watching someone else? And 2 of those were from museum professionals who were interested in the technique. So once we've got our ethics sorted, we've got our signs, our badges, we have a trained up group of people who know that they can always let people withdraw from studies, then we actually have to get down to the practicalities of collecting some data. Here's two of my volunteers when they were doing some training in the Museum of Zoology, and also here's a picture of someone writing in his notebook on the Phoenix Islands. So I make an individual form for every museum that I track in, for every gallery space that I track in, and here is a sample form. I'm just going to talk you through this whole form now. So the top part is the gallery plan, and I just make these in a standard word processing program, Word or whatever you use. I usually get given a basic gallery plan by the curator, by the museum manager, whoever's got one, and they're not always completely accurate, but I use that as my basis, and then what I do is just add on little shapes in Word or whatever you're doing. I did tell you it wasn't highly technical, but this is how it works for me. So I just make shapes on the gallery plan for every element that we're going to track. So an element could be a case, it could be a text panel, it could be a single object either in or out of a case. It might be an interactive. You can, in the middle of this one, we've got a touch screen. It could be a computer. It could be a book. It can be anything really. So every element should be marked on the plan. I mark text panels in a different shape. Those are the ovals on this plan. I do that for a couple of reasons. I think it makes it easier for the person that's doing the tracking to be able to spot simply which the text panels are. And also I think the impact when you come to presenting the data helps. And I don't redo this plan. So when I've got this plan, when I go back to make my beautiful thermal plan, I just again go back to Word and just change the fill on each box to the colour that I want it to be. That's why I just do it really simply and quickly in Word. So I get my plan, I put little boxes all over it, I print it out, I go and take it into the gallery, and I go and check, and I realise that I've missed out half the text panels. I go back, redo it, go print it out again, go and check in the gallery, and then I usually get someone else to take a copy of it and go around as well. Again, our gallery attendants are really good at that, where we have them, so they will often, if they've got a quiet moment, then they'll often want to help me out with things. So just to make sure that everything is marked on your plan. It's really important for the trackers that they aren't worrying they've got it wrong. It's really important when you're inputting the data, which again I do very, very simply. If you've missed an element out, it's really difficult to add it back in later. So make sure that it's right to start with. I do put on a few notes for myself, so you can see I've marked on clubs and paddles and the model boat and benches. It helps to give a few simple, quick visual clues for the person that's doing the tracking, so they know what they're looking at. So that's the top half of the gallery, and just make sure that you've got everything on it that you want to record. We use standard codes across all of our tracking, which you can see at the bottom right. We'll talk more about those later, but if anyone's got any questions about them, I'm happy to answer them. But we do have our standard codes. I also ask every volunteer to date, initial and number their trackings, and we keep a sequence of trackings. So we have a consecutive number, and then there's just a post-it note in the box file that I have. So when someone's finished their trackings, they write down what number the next person starts at. It's all terribly high tech. We also record what day it's being tracked, what day someone is tracking. We take a note of the weather. I haven't actually done any analysis yet, but there is the question of whether people spend more time in there if it's raining. We take a bit of demographic data, and I always tell my trackers that we're not trying to guess someone's birth date. It's just to get a general idea of who we're tracking. And for this gallery, those age groups fitted with that museum's standard questionnaire age bracket, so that's what we went with. We also look at social groupings, so whether someone is in the museum on their own, whether they come in as a pair, a group of 3 or more people, or a school group. And then we ask for any other information. And people will often put something down there. They might put, you know, it was a big language school group, or I had one recently where someone said that the person that they were tracking was in a wheelchair, and there were a couple of places where they've had to get out of the wheelchair to look at particular objects. I had one tracking that was sort of, it just very abruptly stopped and the person left. And in the other information, they said there'd been a security alarm and the building was evacuated. So all those sorts of things just help me when I'm looking at a blank sheet of paper. If I'm not the one collecting the data, they help me to know what's going on with that tracking, a bit of extra information. And as I've got the initials, if I'm a bit concerned about someone's tracking, then I can just get back to them and say, you know, just be careful about this. So we also decide.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh,
no, I was just going to say, we also ask, we have an invisible line where when someone crosses that line, that's when we start the tracking. And on this gallery, it was at the bottom where those two arrows are going each way. That was a slidey door. So that was our invisible line. When the visitor crossed that, then the stopwatch started and they started the tracking. So that sort of information goes in the bottom line with the time in, time out. Not worried about that, but some trackers like to note it down. I'm interested in the total time that a visitor spends in the gallery as well, because that then is obviously it's not just the same as adding up all the stops, because people move in between. I ask our trackers to change the place where they start. The very first gallery that we ever started tracking in, we had one location for the volunteer to sit, and the case next to them was really poorly visited. And afterwards, we didn't know whether it was because someone was, whether that case was just not very engaging, or whether the fact that there was a sort of scary looking volunteer sitting next to it actually put people off from stopping at that case. So I asked people to vary where they stand and to make sure they mark that so that we can get a bit of a better idea about what's happening. So once I've created my forms, and it's really not a complicated process for me, I print out a whole load and I put together a little file of information. So I put together I've got a training sheet that I give all my trackers when they start volunteering, and I put a copy of that in the box, a whole set of forms, some sharp pencils, a couple of pens maybe, and a couple of stopwatches, sometimes a clipboard. And then it depends what the museum wants as to where we put them. Some places I can leave them somewhere discreetly. One of the galleries that we tracked in had no gallery attendants, so we had a little drawer where we could put a little box file. In other places they were at the front desk, which I think is quite beneficial. It means that someone has to check in when they arrive. So we've got this little box file that's all sitting there ready, waiting for the volunteers to come in and to collect some data. So that's probably quite a lot to take in. So
yeah, maybe, Sarah Jane, we'll just stop very briefly. We've not had any questions yet, but if we just take a quick break and let people gather their thoughts for a second, and maybe if you have, everybody listening, got any questions, if you just want to pop those down. Obviously, Sarah Jane's got a bit more to cover yet. I had a quick question, actually, Sarah Jane. You mentioned trackers. Who do you tend to use for that? Do you use volunteers or staff, or do you have people specialists for it? And do you have to give them any training first?
Yes, we use, I think I've occasionally used staff, but generally it's been volunteers. And we use, we're very lucky in the university museums because we have someone that does go out and get volunteers for us. So I advertised it as a specific project, and I've probably got a team of about 30 who drop in and out. Some of them live in Cambridge but are students elsewhere. Some of them are students here. Some of them are employed full-time doing all sorts of other jobs but come in on Saturdays and Sundays. So I have a big pool of volunteers, and every volunteer goes through the same training program before they start. And we go through, I've got a standard document that I use, and we go through one of these gallery plans for that gallery that we're looking at, and we'll go through it together. We'll make sure there's no problems, and then I create a doodle poll, and they sign up for when they want to come in. And I'll usually pop in and out and just make sure that they're okay. I check through the gallery plans really regularly as well, just to make sure that there's still some consistency. I have to say our volunteers are all absolutely excellent. and they're really, really thorough and really careful. And they've all found it a very interesting project to be involved with. But I just use volunteers and make sure they're properly trained, and they've been fantastic.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks for that, Sarah Jane. We've got a couple of questions. So one here from Kate. I think you've answered the first part. Do you have any problems recruiting volunteers? Obviously not. But do you find that there's any quality issues that you've encountered with them being volunteers?
I have encountered quality issues. I don't think that's to do with them being volunteers. I've had a few, I have had some quality issues, but I think that's where because they're all initialed, and I do go back and check them quite regularly, I will make sure that they're, that I can get back to those people quite quickly and just say, oh, this, I'm not really sure, your timings don't seem quite right, or I'm not sure where that person stopped. Can you just make sure that you record it properly? And generally, because I'm trying to keep on top of it, then it means that I can make sure there's extra trackings. So I'm not just limited to this week, but I can make sure we slot in extra sessions in case there's some that are a bit dubious. And I have withdrawn some trackings that I thought this just doesn't look right, and I've taken that out completely sometimes. So yeah, there can be quality issues, but I think
it's about reviewing them quickly and keeping on top then, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. We've got a question as well from Ella at St Andrews. Thanks, Ella. If the volunteer tracker is also the gallery attendant, do you think it will affect how the data is collected?
Good question. I think gallery attendants can be fantastic at tracking. I don't think it necessarily affects how the data is collected, as long as they're fully trained and they know exactly like anyone else that they're not just trying to big up their favourite section, but there's a general consistency and quality things in there. I've never used gallery attendants to do it, mostly because our gallery attendants are more there for security, and if I take them away from that to watch one particular person, then it means that they can't keep a good eye on the rest of the gallery. But I don't see there's any problem with using gallery attendants. I mean, as I said, they can be give you some of your best information.
Yeah, great. Yeah, maybe just avoiding the loyalty bias. But good. And we've got another question from Sarah at the Shipwreck Museum. This is a good question, and I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking it with smaller spaces. If you have lots of small spaces, you won't be able to see what they're doing. So do you follow them around, or do you have different people stood in different strategic places? I can imagine visitors getting uncomfortable if they're being followed, but not quite sure how else you do it.
Yeah, it is a really good issue. We've tackled it in a couple of different ways. I have used a kind of buddy system where I've had a couple of people tracking at the same time. I'm not a massive fan of it just for consistency's sake. It depends on the gallery. In this gallery space that we're looking at here, the section above the area where it says model boat, that was really narrow, and it was impossible to see really unless you were right next to them. So we did follow people around, not necessarily standing right on their shoulder and listening into every conversation. There are ways of being discreet in the gallery. So they often don't start, and you'll see in a couple of slides' time where I've got a filled-in sheet from this gallery. You can see where the tracker actually started, and they weren't starting near the beginning, but they could still see where they were. We usually, when I start in a new space, get my team of volunteers and we'll have a look at the space, and together we'll work out a few sight lines from which point you can usually see quite a lot. And then there are points where you have to sort of follow them or stand the other side and watch what they're doing. It's funny that I think people that are doing the tracking are always more sensitive to that than the person who is being tracked. And I do think some people notice, and I've had tracking sheets and I've done tracking before where I know someone's behaviour is altered because I'm tracking them, and so I'll withdraw myself and withdraw that tracking. And I think you need to have the flexibility to be able to say, I'm now making them feel uncomfortable, I'll withdraw. And so sometimes you just have to be prepared to put in more hours to get the data that you want. But I do think that, especially if they're in a group, people don't always notice that you're there, and you can be discreet about how you do it without you know, having a raincoat and a copy of the Times with big eye holes cut out of it.
Do you generally have visitors in their sort of normal clothes? And I mean, obviously they're carrying a clipboard, which is or something to hold the sheet on. That's a bit of a giveaway, but are they normally in uniform?
No, not usually. I've got a kind of top tip about that at the end, so we'll come to camouflage.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, maybe then, Sarah, if you want to, Sarah Jane, if you want to carry on with the rest of the presentation, and thanks everyone for questions. We'll take another lot of questions at the end as well. So if you want to carry on now, Sarah Jane. Great, thanks.
Brilliant. So here's my general tracking sheet, and then from there we go out and collect the data. I just wanted to show you a kind of completed thermal plan that I did before we redeveloped the museum here. It's one that you've already seen. But just some of the things that we learned really quickly from doing it. I've got there the direction that people went in, and this gallery was actually designed so that you would go in and turn right, and those are the first cases. It was also designed around the first year undergraduate curriculum, but yeah, it was designed so you go in and turn right, and as you can see, only 31% of people actually went in this expected direction. I think there are a few reasons for this, but not least of which was the fact that if you turned right there, you can see the front desk. Like in this fantastic picture of someone positioned to hold the Union Jack in New Guinea in 1885, people generally, if you're not sure whether you're supposed to be in particularly a university museum, you're definitely going to try and avoid that gallery attendant who might say, are you a student? Or you do know you have to pay? Or what on earth are you doing in here? So this was one of the unexpected outcomes that we discovered from our tracking, was just that people weren't, it was that whole thing about this expected direction. And yes, absolutely, visitors will always find their own way round the museum, however much curators think they want to direct them in a particular way. So this is just where we get to at the end. And here, as promised, here is a completed tracking sheet from one of my trackers, from Madeline. And hopefully this will give you a bit of an idea of how it actually works. So we use a stopwatch to time each stop, and the time in seconds is written on this form. So if you look over to the left of this, just above where she's written exit, you can see the T. That's where she was standing at the beginning of that tracking. And then as the person moved round, she would have changed location a couple of times in order to see what was going on. And those movements vary according to the space that we're using. And then there's arrows that show you which way round, and you can see there's a bit there where she's written walked through, glancing around. We had to define a stop, and lots of museums define stops in many different ways. Some studies include glancing at a case as a recordable event, and you need to describe what someone's doing, or you need to describe how you're going to define a stop. So in the tracking studies that we do, we define a stop as 2 feet planted on the floor and looking at that particular element. If a person glances at a case and then carries on, then that's not recorded as a stop. But for every stop, we mark an X on the gallery plan and add the number of seconds. So I always tell my volunteers, you know, it's usually more important to me to know what element someone's looking at than it is to know exactly where in the gallery they stopped. So I say that X marks the stop, but not necessarily the spot. So I need to know when I'm analysing the data if that person is standing, I don't know, sitting on the bench looking at the clubs and paddles, or are they sitting at the bench looking at the labels, or are they sitting on the bench looking at the model boat? I need to know where they are. So you'll see at the bottom of this tracking, there's an X which says 6S, so 6 second stop, and she's marked an arrow onto the clubs and paddles so that when I'm analysing it, I know, right, that's 6 seconds on that particular element. There's another one at the top, the 3 second stop, she's actually marked which, she put a little arrow on. It's not quite as clear, that one, but there is an arrow there to show me which case that person is looking at. So X marks the stop, but not necessarily the spot. Sometimes when visitors are going through, then they're not looking at a case and they will stop in the middle of a gallery. And I categorise those as non-case stops in my analysis, and I do ask people to record them. And I ask people to record them very clearly as not on or near a case. And after they can always add a note on it, either while they're doing it or at the end. just something on there that helps me to know. It might be that they're texting on their phone, that happens quite a lot. It might be they stop to chat to their friend. It might be that they sit down to read the newspaper, that happens. Just something so that when I'm looking back through, I will definitely get an idea. And that's where these other codes come in. So I've said T is the tracker location when the tracking starts, and then X for every stop. I'm quite interested in what people photograph. And so if people take photographs, we try and mark that on with a P. Discussion around a case, we'll also mark. Of course, we don't know if someone's discussing what they're going to have for dinner or if they're, really intrigued by that model boat, but we do kind of make a note of those occasions as well. I'm really interested in the next one, which I know I've been to museum visits with friends, and you all sort of split up, and then someone sees something that's really interesting, and then your pattern changes because someone's seeing this fascinating thing, and so they come, you've got to look at this really weird picture, or look at this amazing specimen that I've seen. So those occasions where someone is called over to where it is, I'm interested in. We have recorded when someone has been called over as well, and then we have looks up, and sometimes we record look down. So those codes can change depending on the gallery space and what we're doing. In this one, on the right hand side, you can see a bit which I've labelled floating baskets. They weren't actually floating, but people looking up at those, we want to record that. Otherwise, I don't know if people are looking at the objects underneath or at the floating basket. So we try and record that people are looking up. I've tracked in spaces which have been on mezzanines, so do they look down at what's below there? And this is how we sort of start to build up a picture, a slightly more complex picture of what people are doing. There's absolutely no reason why you have to put these in. There's no reason why you have to start with this. You might want to start really simply and just put stops on. And I think that's fine. This is something that I've built into the project that we're doing at the moment. And I haven't got into a deep analysis of it yet, but I think they're interesting elements. Then we use arrows just through the gallery so that we can indicate which direction they're moving. I'm also quite interested in the first 3 stops that people do as they go round. So this is basically what we're recording, and any extra information that people can give me is really helpful. You can see that she's glanced around quite a bit, but rarely stopped to look closely. Now, every one of my trackers, volunteers, ends up creating their own preferred method of tracking. Some people use this form on a clipboard with a stopwatch. Some people fold it in half and put it in a notebook. I've got trackers that like to use their mobile phone for doing the timings. Beeping stopwatches makes you very self-conscious, but people use different ways. We've used their watch to time, and people find their own methods. And I do think it's a matter of practice, and finding your own way through it. Make some forms and get a gallery plan and sit and work out how you think you like it or how it works best for your space. That I think is really important. I can't give you a one-size-fits-all version of doing it, but it's important that we're not being so discreet that we blend too much into the background, because it is ethically important that people have the option to withdraw from this study. We just need to make sure that we're discreet in how we do it. I ask every tracker to have a quick look over the form when they're finished and to see whether it's clear, whether it's easy to interpret. I'm reasonably good at interpreting handwriting, but if I've got a load of X's which don't have a time next to them, that comes back to some of these quality issues that we've been talking about. And it is really important that every stop has got a time and every time has got a stop. Otherwise, it sort of renders the whole tracking unusable, and that's really frustrating for everybody, particularly if you don't get to input your data until after the exhibition is closed. So that's why it's really important to just have a quick flick through, to look through, make sure that everything's going all right, get back to people if you've got volunteers who are maybe not quite so on the ball. But yeah, if every volunteer just has a quick look over the form at the end of each study, if something is a bit ambiguous, write a note on it, or stick it on a new sheet if it's getting really messy. There are so many times that visitors go back on themselves, and you end up with sort of a spiral of trackings that getting quite good at interpreting it, but sometimes it's easier if they just redo it on a new sheet. This is also why I don't pre-number the forms. So if they need to redo it, then they can do it and it's fine. And it's at the end of the tracking, when that person exits, that I ask them to fill in the demographic information at the bottom. By then, they will have had a good idea of who it is. It's really hard to do that at the beginning. I ask people to track and then fill in the bottom section afterwards. So then, after they've finished that tracking, then we use a sampling strategy to select the next person to track. And our sampling strategy says that the 5th person through the door should be the next subject. Now, on some days and in some venues, you could be there waiting for everyone to, waiting for a long time to get another 5 people. But we just need to make sure that sometimes you just need to do the next person through the door. Once we've done that, we can start inputting the data. I use a simple Excel spreadsheet. Well, top left was how I started, which was just simply ones and noughts. Does someone go there? Yes, 1. So I get another gallery plan, I number all the cases, and then the first tracking, right, they stopped at case 4, 6 and 12. They just get a 1 in the box. Then I've got a bit more sophisticated, and now I put in the times and use the facilities of Excel to tell me a tally and an average. But this is the sort of data that I'm collecting, and really I'm not an expert at Excel, and I'm sure there's someone there going, but why don't you just do this? But this is the way that I've built up to do it, and it really can be very, very simple and very straightforward. But it does take time to input all of that data. And I think you need to think about what you're going to use that data for, and make sure that you are collecting that data when you are tracking, and make sure you've got the facilities, the flexibility in the way that you input your data to make sure you can extract that from it. So you've collected it, you've analysed it, you've inputted it, you've analysed it, and then you need to present it. And this comes back to my thermal plans. This is why I start in Word and just make a box, because then when I've got my thermal scales, I can just go back in and change the fill on each box. So here you get a bit of an idea. The section on the right shows you where people have stopped, and the section on the left is where how long people have spent, the time spent at each case. So I present them as separate maps. Then I'll, as usual, make a nice report and give it back to whoever has asked me to do the study. I really think that presenting it visually like this has been the most convincing thing. It was, in that first study where we had the really, really hot spots of cases that were nothing really to do with our gallery, that really did give really important feedback to curators. So having collected, input, analysed and presented it, we said at the beginning on that sheet, on that sign that we put up, that we said the information we were gathering would be used to improve future exhibitions. And I'm not in the habit of lying to my visitors, so I use those to improve things that we do. And our tracking results that we did in Attendant fed into our redevelopment. I've done studies elsewhere where it's fed into funding applications. We still use timing and tracking for our temporary exhibitions. The curators expect me to do it for their displays, and they like to see the results. Sometimes I've used the tracking results to feed into more tracking. There was an exhibition I tracked a few years ago, and there was one case which I knew the exhibition quite well, and this particular case, I just couldn't work out how it fitted into the overall themes of the exhibition. But when I looked at the tracking data, it came out as a real hotspot. So I got another volunteer back and I just said, look, I want you to track this, sit by this case. So I just had this volunteer with a stopwatch. I said, I want you to see what people are doing. Are they reading the label? Are they looking at the object? What's happening? So she did it over a period of several days. She input all her data, and I said, well, what was the results? She said, well, it is really popular and a lot of people stop, but there's a mirror on the object. And people were walking past, they would stop, check out their hair in the mirror, and then they'd walk on. They wouldn't read the label, they weren't really getting the whole point of that element, but the tracking work fed into more evaluation, to more data collection that I could then kind of make sense of how people were using that gallery. Now my final top tips. I've got my 5 C's of observational studies. The first one is a confined space. Don't try to track somewhere that's too large. I think it works best in a smaller area. It's more discreet and you get more accurate results. So a confined space. Secondly, I think you need to use complementary techniques. Don't think of tracking as the only weapon in your arsenal. Look at several techniques which can help you to round out this thinking. We follow up a sample of our trackings with an exit interview. That gives us a more rounded picture of what people are actually thinking when they're going round. So I can link together a particular tracking sheet and an exit interview. So we do that as well. Gives us a better, more rounded picture. So confined space and with complementary techniques. And then when we track, I encourage people to track consistently so that 2 people who are tracking the same person should end up with pretty much the same results. And I do buddy people up so that they can kind of gain from someone else's experience. So a new tracker can work with a volunteer who's a bit more experienced. So consistently. Secondly is carefully. These incomplete forms which end up being a waste of everyone's time. So just every stop has got a time next to it and every time associated with a stop. Especially, as I said, if you're late inputting and the exhibition is closed, there's nothing more frustrating. But people need to be quick and accurate every time. And finally, in camouflage, and you were asking earlier about what you wear, and I do think nothing says I'm following you like squeaky shoes and rattly jewellery as well. I don't necessarily mean that it makes the visitor more aware. Sometimes it does, but I think it makes the person doing the tracking much more self-conscious of what they're doing. And particular museums do attract different people, so I ask people to try and blend in. And especially if they've got, a notebook and their discreet telephone, we do need to be careful about how we do it. But yeah, it's being in camouflage. So tracking should be done consistently, carefully, and in camouflage in a confined space and as one of several complementary techniques. Those are my contact details. I'm happy to get emails or telephone calls from people if I can help in any way. If you need copies of forms or anything, I'm more than happy to send those out. If you've got questions or more ideas, then do let me know, or more questions, then please ask them.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. Yeah, I just put in the chat there, I've done a little bit of visitor tracking myself, and as a woman, I found that one of the things is carrying my handbag still, because it can feel really awkward as a woman suddenly without your handbag in a space when you would normally have it, and it makes me blend in. I feel a bit more like a visitor. So that's usually my trick for camouflage.
Good tip.
Right, but I do love those 5 C's at the end. We'll just give everyone a little chance to get together their thoughts and have a think and post any questions. Or if anybody has any experience of doing visitor tracking or doing observations and you want to share your experiences, maybe if you think you did something really well or something that went a bit wrong and you want to find out why, drop it for us now in the question box. We've got another 10 minutes or so to get through those. I had a question actually, again, Sarah Jane. Do you normally block this into time slots? So do you tell each volunteer you're going to do an hour or 2 hours at a time, or?
Yeah, good. I had that written down, didn't say that bit, did I? No, I do break it today into time slots of a couple of hours, and people sign up, as I said, just on a doodle poll. The advantage of me doing that is I share the link with the museum that is being tracked in, so they can see what's going on, and I can people sort themselves out. But yes, I break the day into 2-hour sections, and I do recommend people not to come for longer than a couple of hours. I think it's just too much. If you're really busy, it's too intense to be there for too long. It reduces your accuracy. Conversely, if the museum is really quiet and you're there for 2 hours and you get, 2 trackings done, nothing makes the day drag more than just not being busy enough. So I do try and encourage people to sign up for a couple of hours and then go away and come back on another day. And we try and make sure that we're getting trackings not just in the week, but also on Saturdays and Sundays. I think here in Cambridge, certainly, audiences change quite a lot throughout the day and at the weekends. So we try and encourage tracking to happen at different periods. And if there's a school group in, then that's who you track because that's who's in. So, you know, it is important that it's the variety of days and audiences that we're getting in.
Yeah, great. And when you have got a large group, do you just obviously pick one person within the group to specifically track and then make any notes on anyone else in the group?
Yes, that is really important. And that, I think, is one of the quality things that I've had to try and get through to some of the volunteers, is that it has to be one tracking sheet, one person. And then you can, you know, note down if they're giggling in the corner at something inappropriate, which often happens here, or, you know, if they're interacting as a group, then just jot it down. But yeah, I do really want one tracking sheet for one person. And then as soon as they've gone, then, you know, it's the fifth person through the door. So if that's another person from the same school group, then that's who it is.
Fantastic. Brilliant. We've got a question here from Rick, who asks, what do you think of using the museum's CCTV for tracking?
Yeah, when we first started tracking, we actually did use the CCTV. And in galleries where there were lots of those kind of tight, small corners, we did use the CCTV cameras. Again, it can work really well. You just need to be careful, again, that you're not compromising your security. So, because it depends on your space, and obviously you know that much better than I do. But yeah, it can definitely be done. And we've also used mezzanine spaces, so we've had people tracking from mezzanine spaces watching the gallery below. That's a nice discreet way of doing it as well. But, and we put signage up on the gallery that was both galleries, the mezzanine gallery and the gallery that was being tracked in, so that people knew what was going on. But yeah, there are always ways and means. But CCTV definitely, as long as it doesn't compromise your own security.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used CCTV myself, but do you think you perhaps lose a sense of the kind of feel of the person? You know, are they walking around a bit fed up, or are they, you know, genuinely looking a bit excited? Do you feel you lose any of that perhaps with a CCTV?
Yeah, I think you might do, but does that make it a better tracking if you think this person is a bit fed up? Does that affect how you do it? Do you know what I mean? But yeah, it's not something that I use a lot, mostly because I now use volunteers to do it, and obviously I can't have volunteers sitting in someone else's museum looking at their CCTV. So, but if you're doing it in your own venue, then I think it's worth trying out, and, you know, try it for a couple of hours, and then try following people for a couple of hours and see how you feel about it. But it can certainly be done.
Absolutely great. Good advice, Sarah Jane. If anyone else has got any more questions, if we can start to pop those in then, so we'll get time. I've got another question, actually, Sarah Jane, about how you find people receive the data. So who do you tend to share your sort of tracking results with, and how is it usually sort of taken?
That's a very good question. So here, when I first started doing all about evaluation and stuff, it was partly for the redevelopment, so that we knew what we were doing when we came back in. But as I said, it's kind of slowly become forefront in curators' minds now. When they're even when they're now putting on an exhibition, they'll come to me and say, I've got this, you know, what do you think about this gallery plan? And I might have some opinions, but I might not. But I think it's, you know, over probably about 6 or 7 years, it's definitely become an expected thing to do. And people are waiting for me to track their galleries and waiting for me to track their temporary exhibitions. So it's definitely become more established. Now, with my cross-university project, museums have been really, really receptive. I've promised to only ever share full results with each participating museum, so they have a full report of exactly how long people have spent, and they have usually been really receptive, I have to say. And I don't know, maybe these reports get filed somewhere in the back of someone's cupboard, but I think people are generally really keen to make sure that what we're providing is an experience that visitors actually get. And if we discover that, so somewhere that I was tracking had a standard format for their temporary exhibition, and they had their gateway objects in a particular position in the gallery, and my tracking showed that that case wasn't looked at in the first 3 stops. It was a very, very small portion of visitors looked at that case, even in the first 5 stops to the gallery. So I was able to go back to this group of curators and say, look, here is your model for temporary exhibitions, but your key objects aren't being looked at. So I think that just helps them to maybe rethink about where they're positioning things. Okay, that case wasn't looked at in the first 5 stops, but this case is. So can we swap those round? I think it's just getting people to analyse the way that sometimes it's always been done. So people generally have been really receptive.
Right. Are they often surprised as well?
Oh, very often surprised. Often I'm surprised though, because I'll look at gallery and I'll think, oh, I bet no one stops there. And then I look at the data and think, no, actually, they really do. So sometimes I think it's good that I'm not actually tracking, that I've got my volunteers to do it, because I wonder whether I would be more influential on it, thinking, oh, but they have stopped. But yeah, there's always a surprise. You know, the whole mirror thing is definitely, and actually we found that again in another exhibition that we did recently. Again, mirrors are the way forward. If you want people to stop at your case.
Maybe not for the right reason. Mirrors behind key objects. Brilliant, Sarah Jane. That's absolutely fantastic. Rick just asked if the webinar is going to be recorded. It has been recorded, Rick. We will send a link afterwards for that. So if anyone's got any final questions or comments or thoughts, or if Sarah Jane, have you got anything else?
Yeah, well, if people have got, advice for me, if you think that you can work out a better way to do it, I'd really love to hear it. I know that we haven't got it right always, so it's definitely good to hear from other people's experience.
Great, fantastic. Well, just quickly, while everyone's having a chance to type, what I'll do is I'll just flick on to the next slide, which is just saying that we genuinely always love to hear anything you have to say. When we finish the webinar, you'll get taken straight to a link which will come up with a very, very short survey. Please fill it in. We're always very grateful, and we always like to hear your feedback, because we do use it. Also, if you've got any comments or anything that you would like to share with us about future webinars or this webinar, drop us an email. Our email is katemeasures@hotmail.co.uk. We have got a question. Sarah's just asked, could you email the tracking plan and completed version so we can look at them more closely? Sarah Jane, would that be okay for you to email that?
Yeah, that's fine. If someone wants, just email me your email address, because I don't have them. So it's just sjh201@cam.ac.uk, and yeah, more than happy to share stuff like that with you.
Brilliant. What might be the best way then is, if Sarah Jane, if you can share it with us, and then we can pass it on to anyone, because obviously our email address is there, so we can put that out. Fantastic. Has anyone got any other questions then, or experiences? If not, we'll bring it to a close. Thanks a lot, Sarah, and thank you to Sarah Jane. I've really enjoyed hearing about it. You've obviously got a massive amount of experience there from a lot of sites, so it's been really useful. I'll be using some of those tips myself as well, so that's really great. Thanks, everybody. We will finish it up then now, and you will be sent to that link. And thanks a lot. Okay, bye.